So this is a big day for Karen because this is her first Sunday to not be speaking. So there's a plus and a minus to that. The plus is hopefully you got a little extra time, a little less stressful this morning. The downside is she has no idea what I'm going to say, what I'm like. She's like handing over the keys, and just like with, she doesn't know what is in store for her. So too bad. So anyway, so the first thing, though, I have to start off with is an apology, actually. There's a number of you who are out there who were in Hopkinton last week, which is where I was last week, giving this exact same message last week. And so some of you clearly need to hear this a second time, I guess, is why you're here. I don't know. But you will be hearing the same message with the exact same, as I was told by someone else, the exact same dad jokes as you got last week, which, just as an aside, you do know how to tell if you're hearing a dad joke, right? I mean, right, if it's a dad joke, it'll be apparent. Okay. So somewhere, someone in about 5 minutes is going to start laughing at your table, and you realize they just got it. But anyway, but I do have to start off with something that I shared last week, and it's kind of still applicable, kind of still not. I'm going to try and claim it for this week, and that is I shared that. So the Thursday before I spoke last week, one of the things that Karen, my wife, and I like every now and then is to treat ourselves to some Chinese food. Yeah, that's I love Chinese food. But of course, what's the best part about Chinese food? The fortune cookie. The fortune cookie is the best thing about it. And so this is my fortune. It didn't come on a 3x5 card. I actually took it and I taped it to this 3x5 card because I was so taken by the fortune. So again, this is the Thursday before I'm speaking. And this was my fortune. Your Sunday will be blessed with happiness and contentment. That was pretty good. That was pretty good. So I claimed that big time for last week when I spoke and made it very clear to the folks who were listening to me speak last week that if they didn't like what I had to say, that I didn't want to hear about it. At least not until the next day, because my Sunday was going to be it would be blessed with happiness and contentment. I would like to try and claim this for this Sunday as well, but I don't know if it'll still work. So far it has, and I would ask your help in keeping it to continue. But all right. So, as Karen mentioned, this is week 3, the grand finale of our series on work. And so what I thought I would do is start off by asking you a little question to think about. And that is, when you hear the word, we'll do a little word association, right? A little word association. When you hear the word work, what is the first word that comes to mind when I say the word work? What was that? Stress. Oh, stress. Stress. Like you said, business strategy, and I'm like, wow, an MBA over here already. Stress. Anything? What else comes to mind? We do have an MBA. That's a different story. What else comes to mind? Effort? Work? Work comes to mind. We think of work. I guess that's... Okay, job. Anyway. So, yeah, those are all good words. And, that's typical. Right? The kind of words that typically don't come up when you think about work are things like joy and passion and fulfillment. Right? It's usually the words like we heard, right? Stress and things like that. Because for us, generally, work feels more like a necessary burden, right, instead of a meaningful pursuit. But hopefully over the first 2 weeks of this series, right, you beginning to learn a little bit more about work, and that work is not the enemy, right? It's not something that we're just supposed to endure. And we saw in these first 2 weeks of this series how it's actually kind of woven into the fabric of God's creation. All right, in the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, we read that the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. That was one of the verses from week 1 of this series, right? And it shows how that work is a part of God's good design, a way that we partner with God and his creative and his sustaining activities. That's part of what work is meant to be. Because if you think about it, God does not need us. He didn't need us to plant gardens, to teach kids, to build bridges. He didn't need us to do that, but he invites us to reflect his character through our work. And when we're solving problems, when we're creating beauty, when we care for others, right, we are participating in God's work in the world. But here's where the problem comes in, because humanity has a knack for taking things that are good from God, and we twist them. And we make them ultimate things instead of having them in their right place from our Creator. And work is no exception. We can do that with work. And I remember an interaction that I had with a coworker that's been more than 25 years ago. And this interaction has always stayed with me. And I was on a business trip visiting my company's factory in, I think this is appropriate given that we have St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. I was in Ireland. And I got into a conversation with one of the guys there about the difference between the way the Irish think about work and the way the Americans think about work. And of course, we were very much kind of overgeneralizing, but we were chatting, and he got this kind of twinkle in his eye, and he looks at me and he says, "Hey, Curt, you know, the difference between you Americans and we Irish is that we Irish, we work to live, but ye Americans live to work." And I thought, wow, that was really deep. That was really good. Just like you guys are probably thinking, wow, that's like the worst Irish accent I've ever heard in my life. But hey, it's St. Patrick's Day coming up. I had to give it a shot. Anyway, when he said that, it could have knocked me over with a feather. I thought that was really good. And that's because for many of us, work is not just a means of service and fulfillment. It can become more than that. It can become our identity. It can begin to consume us and define us. And for some of us, work can actually wind up enslaving us. Another way to put it is that we can make work an idol. And so what I want to do today is unpack that idea about work becoming an idol for us. And we'll do it with 3 things. We'll look at how is it that we wind up making work be an idol, that we can risk having that happen. That's one thing. Secondly, what's the Bible have to say about that and how we should think about work and balance work with other parts of our lives? And then finally, what are some really practical applications that might help us to make sure we keep work in balance, right? So let's dive in with that first one, which is, how is it that we can maybe wind up making work become an idol in our lives? So what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word idol? Now, it depends kind of on maybe your age and some of your experiences, but for a lot of you, maybe you think of something like this. Maybe you think of American Idol, right? In fact, a lot of you grew up watching American Idol and maybe still do. There may be even some of you who aspire to be on American Idol one of these days. I remember Karen and I were season 1. We remember seeing Kelly Clarkson and, pants on the ground and all this kind of stuff. If you were ever around for season 1 and the wackiness of what American Idol was. But that's what might come to mind for some of you. Or maybe what you think of when you hear the word idol is you think of a golden statue that ancient civilizations maybe prayed for or prayed to. And let me just ask here, chance for a little bit of trivia. Does anybody recognize that golden statue up there? I see Mark nodding his head. What do you recognize that to be? Indiana Jones. Very good. Did you guys recognize that's the idol? Again, it depends on your age. Some of you were like, "Who's Indiana Jones?" I don't know who Indiana Jones is. For those of you on the older side, right? Indiana Jones, and this was from the very first Indiana Jones movie, right? And he grabbed this idol. So those are some kind of fun images, some fun thoughts about what idols might be. But let me give you a definition of idol when I talk about that we might make work into an idol. An idol really can be anything that we elevate to a position of ultimate importance in our lives. Anything that we look to for identity, security, satisfaction apart from God. That's what I mean in this context when we talk about an idol. And work can become an idol for us when it consumes our lives and it defines our worth, when career success or titles or achievements become our measure of value. We've made work into something in those cases, something that it was never intended to be. In the book of Ecclesiastes, it's an Old Testament book from the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's filled with important insights about living. And the author of the book, generally considered to be King Solomon, who was one of the wisest and wealthiest people of his time. And here's what he had to say. He said, "What do people gain from all of their labor at which they toil under the sun? All of it's meaningless, a chasing after the wind." Wise King Solomon saw the futility of seeking ultimate meaning in work. Yet, we can often wind up doing that very thing, sacrificing family and health and even faith on the altar of professional success. There's an author, Andy Crouch, and he makes a great observation about idols. He says, all idols begin by offering great things for a very small price. All idols then fail more and more consistently to deliver on their original promises, while ratcheting up their demands, which initially seemed so reasonable. And in the end, they fail completely, even as they make categorical demands. Now, of course, when we talk about work, we're not just talking about the 9-to-5 job. I liked Karen's phrase, I don't know if you came up with it yourself. It's not just the worky work, right? When we talk about work, we're talking about not just that 9-to-5 job, right? Some of you don't work outside the home. Some of you are students. That can be work that we can turn into an idol. We can also take things like hobbies that we're spending other time on. We can take things like church and turn it into an idol. If we are looking to those things as our ultimate sense of identity. Now, some of you may think, this really isn't an issue for me. For my job, I go to work, I'm able to just go there, come home, disconnect from it, not an idol. And so there's a couple of things I would say to that. First of all is remember, we're not talking just about the worky work kind of work. It can be other areas in your life. And the other thing to remember is that it can happen subtly over time. It may not be something that's an issue for you today, but it's something that we need to be mindful about. Because before we know it, we might wind up turning our attention slowly, bit by bit, more and more to other things. But then when we step back and look, we realize, we really have kind of swung the pendulum in how we're thinking about that thing, work, our hobby, whatever it might be. So we have to be mindful of that. And so what I want to do is share 3 warning signs to be mindful of that you might be beginning to slip into viewing work as an idol. And so, number 1, the first warning sign. Work may be becoming an idol if it's the source of your identity and worth. Now, how do you know if that's happening? If your sense of self-worth and identity is becoming intertwined with achievements and status at work, then it could be becoming an idol for you. If you find you're measuring your value by your job title or your salary or how successful you might feel you're being, then work could be becoming an idol for you. And if you're not sure if those things might be true, then I would suggest that you ask your significant other or spouse or a friend what they think about how you're treating your work or other areas where you're devoting a lot of time. Because sometimes other people might see some things like that in our lives better than we may see it ourselves. So that's one thing to keep in mind as a warning. Let me give you a second one to keep in mind as a warning. Work may be becoming an idol if it's taking priority over everything else in your life. So how are you doing in that department? Do you find that you are neglecting other important aspects of life, like relationships or health or hobbies or spiritual practices, to prioritize work? Are you sacrificing personal time, sleep, leisure to dedicate yourself to work? You want a quick test? How many of you have checked your email since you've been here? You know, those things can begin to slowly take control. So that's the second thing just to kind of keep in mind as a warning sign. Third and final one, it may be becoming an idol if it's a source of anxiety and fear. I mean, having some anxiety and fear about work can be very natural, something that we all kind of have probably experienced at some point in our life, depending again on how we're defining work. But it could be becoming an idol if it's a constant source of stress. If you find yourself obsessing about it, about meeting expectations. And an early indication that this could be happening is if you realize that you're struggling to relax or disconnect from work, even when you're not physically in the office, physically at your place of work. So those are some things just to keep in mind, to be warnings for us that we could be slipping into having work being an idol in our life. So what's the alternative? What's the Bible have to say about how do we keep work in the proper balance? And the Bible offers, I think, some good examples that we can follow, and we'll look at a couple of them. The first one we'll look at is from the book of Matthew. So Matthew, in the New Testament, one of the 4 Gospels, kind of biographies of Jesus. And in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus gives some instruction to people who are spending all of their energy worrying about how they're going to make ends meet, how they're going to get what they need to live. And here's what Jesus says. Jesus says, "Seek first God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and all of these other things will be given to you as well." When we place God at the center, work will find its rightful place as a means of glorifying Him, not as a substitute for Him. There's another biography in the New Testament, the book of Luke. And in it, Luke chapter 10, we're going to see another story that illustrates this. It's a story that many of you may be familiar with, and it involves Mary and Martha. Right, now, for some backstory, Mary and Martha are sisters. They have a brother. Who knows Mary and Martha's brother's name? Wow, that's very good. That's actually a much louder response than I got out of those folks in Hopkinton, I just have to say. I was like, wow, that was good. Right, so this isn't the Lazarus story, but Jesus and his disciples are visiting Martha's house, and Mary is there too. And during the visit, Mary sits at Jesus' feet, listening to what he is saying. But Martha, it says, was distracted by by all the preparations that had to be made. Because they just had a whole bunch of people kind of drop in unannounced that needed to be taken care of. And so that's what Martha was spending her time on. Those were good things that she was doing. Those were important and necessary things, just like work can be, right? But Jesus' response to that was kind of a gentle rebuke back to her. And he says, you know, Mary, by sitting at my feet and listening to what's being said, has chosen what is better. It doesn't mean that work is unimportant, right? Jesus himself was a carpenter. But it shows us that work has to find its proper place in the hierarchy of our lives. And there was an example where, because of the circumstances, he was suggesting maybe she needed to kind of rethink priorities. So those are some good examples for how the Bible wants us to think about work in its proper kind of context, not to make it the thing that really rules us. But how do we maintain balance? How do we... I jumped ahead. How do we maintain balance and not get to the point where we're treating work as our idol? And what I want to do is kind of stole an idea from an author named Jordan Rayner and kind of changed it around for my own purposes. But I want to use an acronym, and since we're talking about how do we prevent or make sure that work doesn't become an idol, I'll use the word idol, I-D-O-L, as an acronym to give us some suggestions. All right, so I, the first one, insist that Jesus is better. Now, what do I mean by that? So I'm going to illustrate this with a story that I almost hate to use. It took place back when I was in college, so decades and decades ago. And so I hesitate to use it for two reasons. One, a lot of you weren't even born when this happened. For those of you who were born and remember this, it's going to be kind of a painful story. It's not going to bring back a lot of pleasant memories, because what I'm going to share about is the 1986 World Series between the Red Sox and the Mets. And you could hear the moans. Now, I'm not going to go through the detail of it. And for those of you who are like, 1986 Mets, what are you talking about? World Series, what are you talking about? Then just like Google it and watch it on YouTube, because I'm not going to tell you all the details, because those of us who went through it, we are still scarred by the experience. We are still scarred. But so what happened, right? In this World Series, it's the Mets. It's against the Red Sox, and the Mets won. All right, we'll just say that's what happened in the end. My wife and I, at the time, Karen and I were just boyfriend, girlfriend. We weren't married at the time, but we watched the World Series, and the really painful time in that World Series was this. This is Game 6, and I almost wanted, like, I have to sit down almost, but that's a picture of kind of the end of Game 6. You can see poor Rich Gedman walking very dejected, the poor guy. Anyway, but what I point out is in the middle of that picture, you see the guy, Knight, number 22. All right, that's Ray Knight. Ray Knight. And so he was the third baseman for the Mets. And he had actually a pretty bad reputation. He was kind of a rough guy. There had been a couple of brawls in the World Series, and everybody pretty much said they were all started by Ray Knight. I mean, he was a really easy guy for the Red Sox to not like. And then, this is them scoring the game-winning run of Game 6. Anyway, and so it's him doing that, right? They win Game 6, you go to Game 7. All right, the Mets win Game 7. Fine. So the curse isn't broken. We got to stick with it it's fine. All right. And so what happens? The game ends. Ray Knight is named MVP of the World Series. on top of everything else. And what do for the person named MVP? The sports reporters come up to him, they stick the microphone in the guy's face. You've just won the World Series. You have been named MVP of the World Series. What do you think? And what does Ray Knight say? He says, that was really great that we won the World Series, but it's not nearly as good as having Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And Karen and I look at each other and like, what? What? We want to hate this guy. We have so many reasons to hate Ray Knight. And he says that? Oh, man. We were so conflicted. But what he was doing, he actually was doing that first principle of I, insisting that Jesus is better. And it's kind of common, frankly, I think, to see athletes will do that. They'll say things like that, which I think is kind of cool. But we are not likely to be in a situation like Ray Knight, right? It's a fun kind of, well, not fun's not the right word, an interesting kind of story, but one that we're not going to experience. So how can we apply this? So here's what I would suggest. The next time that you have a great celebration, or something really good that's happened in your life, insist that Jesus is better. Now, how do we do that? Well, one thing that I would suggest that maybe you could do is to reserve one adjective for God alone. So what do I mean by that? So I read a story about one guy who, anytime something great happened in his life, it could be work-related, maybe he had one of his kids that got married, maybe he just ate a great pizza. He would say, that was good. That was really good. That was great. But what he won't ever say is, he'll never say that was awesome. Because he's reserved the word awesome to describe when he realizes God is working in his life. And he will only use the word awesome to describe God. He has reserved that word to describe God alone. I thought that was pretty straightforward, easy to say, really hard to do, I will tell you. Something that I'm trying to incorporate for myself, and I would challenge you with, is to take one word and reserve it for God alone. Because it takes some thought to do that and not slip into using it, and it helps you just remember in your head that God is better, that Jesus is better when you force yourself to do that. So that's one little, it's kind of simple but little practical application to help you insist God is better. So that's the first one. Second one, don't cross your guardrails. Don't cross your guardrails. What are guardrails? Guardrails, right, those metal things on the side of the road when you're driving, and they're intended to keep you out of dangerous situations, to make sure you don't even come close to getting into a bad situation. And so we can have guardrails for our own lives if we have habits that we're struggling with that we can put in place to keep us away from even coming close to those. And the Bible illustrates guardrails. I think of the story of Daniel. Again, many of you are familiar with Daniel. It's in the story of Daniel is in the Old Testament. He lived about 600 years before Jesus was born. He was a Hebrew, and the Hebrews were conquered by the Babylonians. Again, since you guys are so good with these questions, who was the king that conquered the Hebrews? Nebuchadnezzar. Very good, yes. I'm not surprised now to hear everybody yelling that out. Nebuchadnezzar was the king. He conquers the Hebrews, and he takes the best and the brightest. So he'd take that whole table, and he brought them to Babylon because he wanted to have them work in the government and integrate them into the culture. And Daniel was one of those people that King Nebuchadnezzar brought to Babylon. He worked in the government for King Nebuchadnezzar, but he was able to maintain his devotion to God. And in the very first book of Daniel, it says that Daniel resolved not to defile himself. In today's terms, we might say that Daniel refused to let his work compromise his values or consume his identity. Now, what were his guardrails? So one example of guardrails was when they were in the court, they had the food that had been sacrificed to the Babylonian god that they were supposed to eat. That was the food that was provided to all of them. And he said, you know what? I'm not going to eat that food. I'm not going to eat that food. And so why was that? It wasn't like eating that food was going to kill him. But he knew by eating that food a couple of things. One, it was going to be every time you give in a little bit to those kinds of demands, it gets harder and harder to not give in the future. So he knew that it was important for him to maintain that guardrail. And he knew what it would mean for those people around him who saw the example that he was sharing. So he resolved to follow God and God's commands, and he only ate vegetables, and he didn't eat that food. And what he was able to show through the success he had in doing that was that we can be excellent at our work while still setting boundaries that honor God. So I would just challenge you to think about what are some guardrails for you and your work that you can put in place. Maybe it's things like turning off email after hours, saying no to an extra project so that you can spend some time with family, or keeping your Sundays reserved for worship. Establishing guardrails that honor your faith and protect your relationships. Ensure that your work supports your life rather than consumes it. And again, if you come up with what some of those guardrails might be, share them with your spouse or significant other or faith group or a friend so that they can help hold you accountable. So that's D. O, offer your talents generously. Offer your talents generously. One way to prevent work from becoming an idol is to find opportunities to use your talents and abilities to benefit others. And so what are some ways to do that? One of them is to be a mentor. Some of you may work at places that have formal mentor programs, so it may be kind of easy to do something like that. But even if it's not, you don't need a program like that to make an impact on someone else's life. I can guarantee you that there's someone 10 years younger than you who would love to be able to learn from you. And so I would challenge you to find someone like that and bless them by taking the initiative to go to them. Another thing you can do is volunteer your skills. We have plenty of opportunities through the church that you can find. If you are wanting to be able to find an opportunity, go to see someone like Carol in the back who has a great catalog of service opportunities, and there are many organizations around that can help do that. This is also a chance for me to put a plug in for RAFT, the Refugee Resettlement Initiative, which could help you with either of those to get involved with refugees who would greatly benefit from your talents and abilities. So that's O, offering your talents generously. Last one, L, limit your labor regularly. Right? God designed us for rhythms of work and rest. In the Old Testament, God commanded his people to observe the Sabbath. Why? Because rest is an act of trust. It's saying, God, you are in control, not me. The world does not revolve around our efforts. Taking time to rest and to recharge honors God, and it strengthens us for the work that he's given. There are plenty of examples that you can find in the Bible, and I'm not going to go through these, but just to say they're out there in the Bible where Jesus takes time to get away by himself and recharge, and that he encourages his disciples to do the same, and sometimes does that with his disciples. It's something that Jesus models for us to follow. And so how can we practice this to keep this, help with this balance? Schedule that downtime into your week, just like you schedule work things on your calendar. Right? It's time to not just recharge, but consider it to be sacred time to let you reflect and reconnect and just enjoy God's creation. It can really help you with your relationships, with your relationship with God, with others, and to impact your overall well-being. So in conclusion, remember that although we were made to work, we were not made to live for work. When we seek first his kingdom, work takes its rightful place, not as a tyrant in our lives, but as a tool for God's glory. In that balance, we can find joy and purpose and peace. Because remember, Jesus did not die to make you a better worker. He died to make you a new creation. Your value doesn't come from your productivity, your title, or your salary. Your value comes from being loved by God. And when we grasp that, when we really grasp it, it frees us to work excellently without working excessively. To achieve without being enslaved by achievement. So this week, ask yourself, is work ruling my life, or am I offering it to God? Are there any adjustments that you might need to make? Because the key is balance. Work hard, but rest well. Provide for your family, but invest in relationships. Seek to work with excellence, but seek God first. Because when we do those things, we'll find that work is no longer a burden, but it can be a blessing. So let me pray. Heavenly Father, grant us wisdom to see our work through your eyes. Help us serve with excellence while maintaining boundaries that honor you and protect the relationship and the relationships that you have given us. May our work lives reflect your character and advance your kingdom. Guide us in finding the balance that brings glory to your name and peace to our souls. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thank you all very much. I think what Karen is going to do is give us a preview of what comes ahead in our next series as we head into the Easter season.